I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I can give this presentation in 30 minutes, 3 hours, or 3 days. Unfortunately, I have only 30 minutes, so I'm going to do my best. With that said, for those ones that were educated in the decades of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, please notice that I'm going to start talking as an old man, because I am an old man. But things were different back then. The focus of the management was different. We were talking about management for single species. Let me see if I can find how this works. Habitat management, rangeland management was already complex enough back then. If we add another 1 or 2 species of wildlife as a priority, in some cases even more important than cattle, then it becomes really, really complex, and things change. So I'm going to be talking about the changes that have happened in habitat management over the years. Even when the basic needs remain the same, when we are managing for cattle and deer, things change a lot because they prefer different foods, they have different needs, etc. With that said, I'm going to be talking about the concept of range management, the use of habitat mechanical treatments, invasive grasses, and cattle grazing as a habitat management tool. That's what I'm going to try to cover. The concept of a range condition was developed a long time ago, at the time when cattle was the main species to manage, or domestic animals in general. So it goes from poor to fair, depending on the percentage of plants of the climax vegetation of the ecological site that are present in there. However, we can see that in this picture, this is the typical ecological site of the coastal bend with 50% sea-cold blue stem, probably 5% of forest, and some brush vegetation. On the other hand, over here, we see, and this might be considered excellent range condition. Over here, well, there is no 50% of sea-cold blue stem, and it's in the same area. So what range condition are we looking for? Well, if it's for cattle, this is what we're looking for. But for wildlife or for deer, it's a different story. So the concept of range condition is becoming obsolete. And instead of that, we are using similarity index, which is nothing else but the percentage of plants that are supposed to be in the plant community. And then we can move from there to whatever we need. This, for example, it might be a habitat, a rangeland in poor condition for cattle, according to the traditional method. But poor range condition for what? If it's for deer, this is what we are looking for. I mean, diversity of brush species. Most of the times in Texas, we are in a drought. I'm not calling for it. We have had a good run. So I'm hoping we're going to keep on that trend. But range condition for what? For deer, this is perfect. This might be perfect. Because, how do I go back? Okay. Because we have the cover, the thermal cover that Jacob was talking about. We might not have enough grass to maintain a high number of cattle, but for deer might be what we are needing. So poor condition for what? Similarity index is a term that will fit better the needs for evaluating habitat in the present times. So another thing that has changed is the way that we do habitat mechanical treatments. In the past and with the development of the root plow, we clear lots of acres of land. Those acres, the objective was very clear, and it certainly seemed like the right thing to do at that time. We could take areas of brush vegetation that were very, very diverse from a productivity of 1,000 pounds per acre of grass to 3,000 pounds per acre. And this is clever blue stem. I'm not showing any data on animal productivity this time on clever blue stem, but you can have a profitable cattle operation on clever blue stem. So at the time, seemed like the right thing to do. But as wildlife become increasingly important, when we use these treatments, mechanical treatments to the vegetation, we are getting rid of valuable species like Grangenum, Comas, Texas kidneywood, prickly pear, all of those that are important for deer. So what happened when we clear an area with the root plow and then we let it revegetate again? Well, we have an area dominated by mesquite or huisache, but all these important ones, we lost them. So with that, one of the first things that need to be done when applying mechanical treatments is to evaluate those areas that need to be left alone. An area like this, where we have Texas kidneywood, one of the most important species for brush species for deer, Commeline erecta, dayflower, one of the most important forbs, orange sexmania, and then Tasajillo, pretty good mass producing. You know, why do we want to do something to that? Just leave it alone. It's good as it is. So, but the other thing that has changed is that when we used to do mechanical treatments, we were thinking in a one-shot approach. And mechanical treatments, in general, any practice that we do to manage broad vegetation need to be considered in the long term. What is going to be next? Because we can change from having an area dominated by single stem mesquites. After roller chopping, this is what we're going to have, 10 stems. And if we roller chop again this, the following year, we're going to have 20. We just piss them off. So we have to think in the long term, because we can transform habitat that is like this to basically ocelot habitat. And I got some examples of that. This area had no treatment. That was the control. This is another pasture that was roller chopped after 30 years. Look at the cover. I mean, you can walk through here. There is a space for some forbs or grasses to germinate. There is nothing in the bottom of this. So we have to see this in the long term. This is the same area in infrared. Just look at this. How thick the vegetation is after 30 years of roller chopping. Compared, you can see herbaceous vegetation growing or bare ground in this area that had no treatment. So we have to consider mechanical treatments in the long term. Because when we do improvements, we want important forbs for deer, we want cattle for grasses. That's part of the objectives of habitat management. But or plants that will attract insects for quail or for turkey. So, but, you know, the other thing that we found out is that what is more important, to have certain plants or just to have lots of different plants? We published this book in 2007, Tim Fullert and myself. And in this book, we had a list of plants that we consider good for white-tailed deer. We had a ranking value of deer forages. Then we did the second edition of this book in 2016, 9 years later, and we removed all lists. Because one of the things that we learned is that for deer, it's more important to manage for plant diversity, lots of different plants, than for specific plants that might have a high nutritional value. Because what they might consume in a dry year is different than what they are going to consume in a rainy year. In the rainy year, some plants we might say, well, this is not good. Well, guess what? In the dry year, that is the only thing that is green. So the more, if you want to do a quick evaluation of deer habitat and have an assessment, just look at the plant diversity. The ones that you find more diversity, that is a better habitat. Now, we talk a lot about introduced invasive grasses. Where is Eric Grumman? Right here. Okay. Eric, I'm sorry, but I'm going to piss you off. You know, in terms of habitat, we say, well, introduced invasive grasses are bad. And there is a point in there, you know. But what we need to think is the balance. Because we no longer, many ranches that try to focus on wildlife management remove cattle because it was a pain. They didn't like it, they didn't want to, and in some cases it was a well-justified decision because the rangeland, the habitat was overgrazed, but for how long? That is the question. So having the right balance for the species that we are managed, that is the key of habitat management. Now, why are we thinking only in wildlife? Well, certainly, in many cases, it's a better business than the cattle business. In the cattle business, we walk at a fine line between making and losing money. And in most of the cases, we are on the side of losing money. But with that said, wildlife, is it better to have only wildlife? Well, some of the unintended consequences is that with the cattle removal to focus on wildlife management, well, there was a lot of encroachment of introduced species. And then everybody, when we talk about wildlife, there's a common thinking that wildlife is something beautiful that floats in the air, just being beautiful. And that's not true. They can overgraze too. This is an area in Sonora, Mexico, a section, high fence, with bighorn sheep. And guess what this plant is? Creosote bush. That's the only place that I have seen creosote bush overgrazed. And that was, look at the browse line of this tree. Wildlife can overgraze too, so we need to be careful with that. Cattle, at the end, cattle grazing can be beneficial, neutral, or detrimental depending on how we manage, but that is our decision. It's not the cattle decision in most cases. And in this study, that was not a scientific study, but we covered 2.1 million acres of deer habitat in South Texas, and that was back in 1999. I was an invited professor in Kingsville, and ranches that have in eastern South Texas, ranches that have cattle and livestock, cattle and white-tailed deer, produced bucks that were 20 pounds heavier than ranches that didn't have any cattle. And then in eastern South Texas, there was no difference. But what this means is that the two species can be compatible if we do a good job managing the grazing. So with the removal of cattle to focus on wildlife management, there was some unintended consequences. Encroachment of invasive grasses, habitat loss for some wildlife species, and excessive accumulation of fine fuels, which can lead to wildfires. This is a pasture of a clever blue stem with about 5,000 pounds per acre. There is no diversity there. If we want to evaluate how good this might be for white-tailed deer, this is bad. There is no diversity there. But since there is no cattle, there is nothing that can consume that grass. A wildfire in an area like this, it will be almost impossible to control. Some of the invasive species that we are dealing with is guinea grass, buffalo grass, clever blue stem, and then those are introduced, and then tanglehead, which is a native. Some of the reasons, because of the encroachment, the lack of cattle grazing, and changes in the rainfall patterns to a kind of monsoon type. In the last years, we have had rains starting in June, and these grasses really like, these are more kind of tropical grasses, really like that pattern distribution. But when I first came to Texas in 2001, one of the questions that they asked me, do you know how to control guinea grass? Do you know how to manage guinea grass? I said, well, I know how to kill it. I've been trying to make it survive under grazing for 18 years in Mexico, and we kill it all the time. So that's the easy part. But how can we manage it? Well, basically, the question is, can we eradicate exotic grasses? And we need to be careful with that, because I'm not afraid of buffalo grass or guinea grass. But if we eliminate buffalo grass and then we get clever blue stem, that is the end of it. We can kill it. It produces a lot of seed, it's very resistant to grazing, and we might be able to manage it. But as far as getting rid of it, it's not in the picture. Not unless it's a very expensive way. I know that we have had some successes getting rid of it, but the cost is pretty high. So what can we do? Well, back in 2002, we conducted this study to test patch burning and Carroll Grazing. My mistake was that when we published the information, I didn't call it patch burning. Sam Fullendorf from Oklahoma State University published it 2 years after me, and he called it patch grazing. And then now, every time that somebody talks about patch grazing, they say, oh, Sam Fullendorf. I did it first. I just didn't call it the right time, the right thing, But we burn patches on guinea grass, and this is what you get. You get dry vegetation that can carry a fire pretty good, and then the regrowth is 10% crude protein, highly palatable for cattle. So cattle will concentrate in those burn areas. In this study, we basically decrease the density of guinea grass plant from 93,000 to 58,000. And plant species richness increased from 300%. Some of we found 10 forbs that were considered pretty good for deer, 6 forbs that were considered pretty good for quail. All the way from lazy daisies to coreopsis, wood sorrel, all of those good ones. So it worked, basically. How about tanglehead? Tanglehead is supposed to be in the ecological sites of the coastal bend in 5%. But and that 5%, that could be a good nesting spot for quail or turkey, or a good hiding cover for a fawn. However, it can go from that, already shocking some of the native species, to that, a monoculture. And under that, it's the palatability of tanglehead for cattle is extremely low. They don't like it. It's very coarse, it lacks of nutritive value, and cattle just don't graze it. But so we can go from something like this that might be good to something like this that could be catastrophic. Part of the reason for the increase of this is the lack of cattle grazing. Cattle have learning mechanisms to know what plants to graze. So if you bring a cow from a place where a tanglehead do not exist, it's going to take a while for them to get used to it and then start grazing. What can we do about it? Well, we designed a study to evaluate patch burning, and this is on the palatability and the effect on the plant community of cattle grazing. This is how the pastures look like, and this is in the sun sheet of Hebronville. We wanted to see the effects of cattle grazing and patch burning on plant community composition, pasture utilization by cattle and wildlife, and productivity of the cow-calf operation. We use a 236 acres pasture, heavily infested with tanglehead. That was located in a private ranch in Jim Howe County. And the red patches were the patches that we burned. The yellow patches were the controls. And in this picture, the red dots were were tanglehead. And this is before the born. I didn't born this pasture. The owner of the ranch did it, and he had a very particular way to do it. But we light it up, and it was a hot fire. We had about 5,000 pounds per acre, and this is how it looked like. This is right after the fire. This is, and then we put the cows. The cows were already there when we did the born, and we fit the cows with GPS collars, and we were taking readings every half an hour. So we got the points where the cattle was during the day. That was a month after the fire, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, and 5 months. Big difference between the picture of before the born. In terms of plant species richness, before the borning, in the borned patches, we had 2.5 plants per quarter square meter, and it increased to 8.3 after the born. Big difference. In the areas of with no borning, we had 4.8 plants per quarter square meter. We had about a 300% increase in plant species richness. And the borned plots had a 172% increase in plant species richness compared to the control. This is how the pasture look, how open, We could see some bare ground. This will be good for quail, good force for white-tailed deer, etc. And the percent utilization, I mentioned that tangled head is very unpalatable. Well, before the born, the borned patches had a 50. The borned patches had a 51% utilization compared to the onboard patches that had only 5 point something of utilization. Big difference. The nutritive value of the borned tangled head was high enough for the cows to prefer it. Carroll utilized 8 times more available forage in the borned patches as compared to the unborn patches. So we actually were able to attract these animals to the born areas. And this is how the areas look like. These were the controls. These were the born patches. Big difference. The mean percentage GPS points prior to the born, 1.8. After the born, 6 months after the born, 8.4. So there was a cattle used 4.5 times more the borned patches of tangled head. That is what we were trying to do. So we can actually use prescribed fire and Carroll Grazing to manage these populations of tangled head. Winning rate, 90%. Winning weight, 550 pounds. Pretty decent for the area. And we stocked the pasture at 23 acres per animal unit. So it worked pretty good. And this is one important thing on this study is that we conducted this study for 5 years. And after 5 years, the effects of the born still were visible, meaning that once the animals started grazing those patches, they remain on top of them, limiting the growth and expansion of tangled head. Now, with the development of the root plows and all that, I mean, we had a lot of introduction of grasses, just because some of these introduced grass producing good forage for cattle, and that was the objective at the time. And we have been complaining about all this. Well, do we really know enough about exotic grasses in terms of how bad they are for wildlife? Or we're just bitching around? Because this is a painted bounty with a seed of guinea grass in the peak. And look who took the picture, Tim Fulbright. One of the ones that was 100% against any introduction, But these pictures are in a ranch in Sonora, Mexico, 50,000 acres, pretty good mule deer. And I will show you some data on that. Because the quality of the deer, of the mule deer, is actually pretty good. In a wildfire that happened in 2008 at the Chaparral Management Area, in March of 2008, deer consumed more prickly pear and buffalo grass regrowth in April, then shifted to brush regrowth and then forbs after the rain, and there was no differences in body condition score or and fetal development appeared to be normal. So are exotic grasses as bad as we think, or we just don't have enough data? We published in 2013 this paper in the Wildlife Society Bulletin, and we discussed some of the things. Because, in some places, they are not going to stop planting some of these exotics. Sonora, Mexico is one of them. They rely very heavily on cattle production, and they don't have the subsidies that we have here in the United States. They have to make the work. That's the way of living. So, and this is one of the ranches that I mentioned to you, where they have mule deer and cattle at the same time. And this is some of the data. In 6 years, look at the percentages of buffalo grass in the pastures, all the way from 50 to 80 to 80 something. That's what they have in the habitat. And from 2006 to 2012, these are the animals they harvested. And that includes the largest typical Boone and Crockett buck ever taken by a lady. It's in the Boone and Crockett records. And they have a few others. So are those grasses as bad as we think? This is a buck that was harvested there, this record, the record buck. And look what is behind it, buffalo grass. Then look at this little guy. He has the mouth down to the bottom of the plant of buffalo grass, because after the rain in the spring, if they get some rain, this is the Sonoran Desert, and if they get some rain, the first thing that springs out is buffalo grass. And I have seen rumens full of blade of buffalo grass. So are they as bad as we think? Because everything else is dry, is not growing back. So at least for a short period of time, buffalo grass is a resource for the deer in this area. I would like to conclude my presentation by stressing out that the concept of range condition is no longer applicable, because now we have more than one species and not only cattle to manage habitat for. Mechanical treatments to improve habitat must be taken, must take in consideration areas that should be left alone, that are naturally diverse, that is good for cattle, good for white-tailed deer. And then after that, there must be a long-term planning on how those areas are going to be maintained. Exotic invasive grasses that were part of the product of the development of root plows should be studied in a deeper way. And I'm going to leave that to the younger generation, because I am on the way out. But somebody should do a serious study on how these grasses are contributing or affecting to habitat management for deer. And then Carroll Grazing, if properly managed, can be a tool with a prescribed fire to manage populations of exotic grasses. One thing that I couldn't include in this presentation is about the estimation of carrying capacity for cattle. In a grazing study that we conducted at the East Foundation, one thing that we found is that cattle didn't graze patches that has less than 460 pounds per acre, meaning that they were concentrating in those areas of high productivity, meaning that grazable area might not be what we are calculating. Because in a range of 10,000 acres, and that 50% has less than 460 pounds per acre, well, it's not a 10,000 acres, it's only a 5,000. So that might need to be taken into consideration when calculating carrying capacity for cattle. Thank you very much.